their knowledge about colonized territory, where they wanted to know India through their text. In as much as there were people who came in as missionaries, travelers, so on and so forth, but largely the paradigm within which colonial rule operated was understanding text, various literary sources, which is why Indology became a very important discipline, right? Now, even after ruling, you all know that 1784, long back in 1784, the Asiatic Society came into existence, which was basically to study India in terms of its seminal text, Indological sources. But even after studying and governing India studying for the purpose of governing India for 100 years, colonial rule came almost kind of transfixed in 1857 when the Sepoy Mutiny occurred. It was not, it was, whether it was a war of independence or so on and so forth, that is a different issue altogether, which I'm not going to get into. But what it was, why was it significant, was that it was a kind of a reminder to colonial rule about how little, after 100 years, how little still colonial rule knew about itself, knew about its people that they wanted to colonize, that they could not even predict certain things that grew up in their backyard, certain things that had, developed, which they were not aware of. And therefore, there was gradually this shift happening within colonial rule from the study of the text as sources of information about India to the empirical context as the more important, authentic area of collecting information. Which is why you have the census becoming more important a phenomenon post 1857, gazetteer writing, right? You have the Indian civil servant, Hunter, who became the first, you know, first exact term I'm forgetting, who became the first, mm, who became the first, the Indian civil servant under whose, I'm not being able to remember the exact nomenclature, but under whom the first imperial gazetteers were published in 1870s. What was this imperial gazetteer was? It was a gazetteer of all governing districts that constituted the Bengal, Madras, and the Bombay Presidency that colonial rule had brought under its governance. The imperial gazetteer, which that it would not only provide certain geographical information about district, but every minute information about district, which a district collectorate who has been appointed to go to a district would read this gazetteer overnight, and next morning he would be able to come to this office and take over his job as the district collector. And through his instant familiarity with the district, using or adopting that particular gazetteer. Now, this was made possible not by writing text, but by undertaking survey of the region, undertaking certain tools whereby they started to talk to the people in concrete flesh and blood. In other words, the people as they are not represented in the text, but the people who are actually acting, living as living, alive people. And this is something which had greatly contributed to ethnography's foundational logic, that we are the ones who look at the context and look at things as they are played out on a everyday basis in a particular area, and the people that we deal with are the people who are not always guided and governed by the text, but deeply implicated in their context. In other words, the text will not mention these concrete living people, but the context will talk about them through their actions, through their living, through their ways of life, through their practices, through their activities. This became the major trope around which a number of ethnographic monographs had been published, developed. I named only few. Malinowski's Argonauts, Andaman Islanders by Radcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard's Noir Religion in Africa, or Witchcraft, Oracle, Magic among the Azande in Africa. You have Edmund Leach writing on politics of Highland Burma. You have Clifford Geertz writing on the Balinese cockfight. You have uh, Ralph Nicholas writing on smallpox. You have Ralph Nicholas writing on the deltaic villages of Bengal. You have M.N. Srinivas writing on the religion and society among the Kurds of South India. You have Scarlett Epstein studying Indian society, the South Indian two villages. One is a dry village, other is an irrigated wet village. And a number of monographs, ethnographic monographs, had been just published all over the world, constantly instituting, validating the methods that have been classically canonized as ethnographic method. That field worker would go to a distant location, live with the people for a longer time, you know, pick up their language, cultivate long-standing relation with them, build rapport, and then do a very in-depth account of those people, collect in-depth information about them to be able to bring all of them when he leaves or she leaves the field, to be able to write in a manner in which his anthropological knowledge goes into the making of that particular story of people, where anthropological knowledge that he had learned in university, the repertoire that he had mastered in his anthropology career in the university, would all be applied in producing that account. And it is his account which becomes authenticated, A, because he has followed certain distinct rigor of doing that field work, and second, there was a particular rigor that he has also used in writing about the account of that people, which he calls his monograph, right? Now, these two together had ruled, prevailed as anthropological method and ethnographic method within anthropology, that in some senses anthropological discipline and ethnographic method, they became almost coterminous, one feeding into the other in every possible way. In other words, you have done your field work in a particular place, you have written your monograph, but there were things that later cropped up as problems that could be found associated with that particular piece of ethnography, that there are certain questions which arose within anthropological circle among the anthropologists about, in one particular way, that monograph has been, that field work has been done and a monograph has been produced, but that's certainly not the only way in which field work can be done. So it is on the basis of the inadequacies of the earlier field work that a subsequent field work had been carried out in anthropology, and a different kind of a monograph had been produced. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest, that inner questionings and contestations within the discipline had constantly sharpened the modalities of conducting fieldwork, modalities of carrying out fieldwork. For example, just give you a one instance. When Malinowski had done his fieldwork among the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, he was looking at their science, looking at their technology, right? That how does the native science grow? How does a native practice science? Is it the same way that a European practices science, gifted by European enlightenment, etc.? Or is it that uh, the native or the primitive practices science in a different way? And Malinowski says at the end of his monograph that the Tobriand Islanders, who he the Tobriand Islanders, meaning the island where he carried out his fieldwork, is Tobriand, and therefore the people who live there are the Tobrianders. The Tobriand Islanders, he suggests, and he says in his monograph that even Tobriand Islanders had a notion of science, right, which can be compared to that of the European science. In other words, what you're saying, that the Tobrianders are largely society where written traditions are not present. In other words, there is nothing written available. People are constantly living society orally. So whatever they say is all oral. Whatever they perceive is all oral, right? But even there in their oral culture, they have a particular notion of science, which is very deep, enriching, and therefore it is absolutely foolhardy to follow a colonial practice in describing their science as uncivilized, mediocre, average. Right? Many years later, when another anthropologist called Edmund Leach, he read Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific, and when he conducted his fieldwork among the communities of Highland Burma, he suggested that in saying that Tobriand Islanders also practice science which can be compared to the European science, Edmund Leach said Malinowski was being simply condescending to the Tobrianders in a similarly colonial way, that he thought that one should study native science only in the light of a yardstick that is set out in the West. In other words, one should study native science, but always compare it with the European science. And that is wrong. That is almost as condescending as a colonizer, White, had always dubbed the colonized as being underdeveloped, less civilized. And therefore, Leach saying that Malinowski wouldn't have done greater justice to the Tobriand Islanders if he had said that the kind of science that the Tobrianders practice is unique, distinct, and by no way can be compared to that of the Western science. In other words, what he was suggesting, that by comparing, you are trying to make Western science appear as a tool of dominance over the native science. And when I say that they have a distinct notion of science which cannot be compared, which does not have a parallel with Western science, I am assigning that particular science of the native a distinct autonomous character which cannot be reduced to that of the West. So these are the kind of inner questionings that arose within anthropology in order to steer anthropology towards its sophistication, finer argumentation, and a kind of a seamless professionalization, right? Entirely building this whole idea of context. But these inner questionings continued within anthropology and continued even beyond Edmund Leach and many others, right into the decade of the 1980s, when there was a greater rethinking started to happen within anthropology, particularly followed by a very important book which you may have heard about and you may have read. If you haven't, then I would recommend that you should read, which is Edward Said's Orientalism. It was a book that Edward Said published in somewhere in 1978, and which broke certain important paradigms, right? What did he say? Now, here is somebody, Edward Said, who is a Palestinian, but lived all his life and taught in a university in America. So, therefore, here is somebody who is the Europe's other by way of his biography, and at the same time, by way of his vocation and profession, he's part of the first world. And it is from that kind of an in-betweenness that he wrote that book called Orientalism, where he said in a very categorical way that the knowledge that West had created about the East for the last 200 years had produced, defined, configured the non-West or the East, the Orient, in a particular way, assigning it certain characteristic features which are almost kind of given and almost as though they are naturalized. What does this mean then? That Orient is underdeveloped, Orient is less civilized, Orient is about non-whites, Orient is about primitives, Orient is about women and their domination, Orient is about poverty, Orient is about lazy native, Orient is about absence of science, Orient is about a culture that is parochial, that is obstacle to further development, so on and so forth. In other words, understanding Orient in terms of irreducible features, right? Now, this book, although it was criticized as something of a totalizing critique of the West, as that by producing by producing Orientalism, said it was argued, said was accused of giving a totalized critique of the East. That means that it was a totalizing critique. There is absolutely no mention of how this knowledge about the knowledge about East had proceeded very dynamically through various paths where there were often disruptions, often discontinuities, often various ruptures that had happened. But Seth made it appear as though it was a complete totalized kind of a irreducible East, where certain features are almost naturalized. But this book had triggered a very important rethinking in social sciences, and which had not escaped anthropology as well. What was the rethinking? The rethinking is that what had so far social sciences that developed its knowledge about society, social phenomenon, and everything that it had studied, and studied as though it was an empirical account, objective, universalized, kind of a very, very biasless account, is full of biases. Because it is ultimately a question of representing the society, representing its people. Only I am trying to make my representation appear as though it is the scientific, because I have followed certain techniques of research which are authenticated by scientific discourse. In other words, I have understood, I have given an account of a people because I have gone there with an interview schedule. I have interviewed them with very specific questions. I have asked certain questions which I have put down carefully, and I have analyzed those questions, put them in tabular forms. How many people have said this? How many people have said that? And have tried to build a connection, a certain kind of correlation between responses, and the very way in which I have produced a very, you know, jargonized, technologized kind of account of social life of people, social phenomenon of people, that by every standard it is scientific and therefore empirical. And this is something which stood questioned in the light of what Orientalism had to say. Because Orientalism had reduced every account, no matter how objective it is, how objective it claims, how universal it claims, how scientifically rehearsed it could possibly be, it is ultimately a representation of a particular kind. And therefore, what became a problem within social sciences, including anthropology, is the question of crisis in representation. That anthropologists had gone to a field, gone to a place, looked at a group of people, studied them, understood their life in their own right, asked them questions, produced a very empathetic account. He had done everything to suggest that natives are not uncivilized. He had done everything to suggest that natives had science, natives had market, natives had a very perceptive life, so on and so forth. But even then, what he has produced is his own authored account, and therefore it is only a representation of that particular life. Therefore, the critique that happened in the late 1980s within anthropology brought once again the question back into anthropology, a question that anthropology for long had avoided, had deliberately posed a counterpoint to, is that anthropology is about context, whereas history is about the text. And that what they had now brought in for anthropology to reckon with is that every anthropological account, every ethnographic encounter, in other words, every ethnographic field work is a textual account of an author. And therefore, it is the author who has consciously produced it, apparently had used all the techniques of research to make it sound as though it is scientific, but yet those tools have only gone to produce an account which is entirely his own. In other words, he came to the field, the way he looked at the field, the way he had prepared his account, the kind of questions that he asked people, and the kind of responses that he got, the kind of things that he had noted, the kind of things that he had witnessed, that he had provided an account, and kind of things that he had seen, and the kind of things that he had never seen, all had been put in the form of an account as if it is absolutely an objectified account. but it is an objective account enmeshed in the subjective character of ethnographer or anthropologist. And therefore, once again, from context, we are coming to a text that let us consider every ethnographic account a text, like a novel or a text. Just as when you read a novel, you read a particular author's novel, but there could be many other authors at work. What does that mean? The characters that author produces, the character that author makes, and the kind of words that he put into their mouth, and the kind of things that they made them say are all basically author's intention at work. And therefore, this intention is the product of many other worlds, many other intention, many other perspectives that had come to produce that author's account, that author's fiction or a novel. And the similar thing could be applied also in the case of ethnography, because what this ethnographer had produced at the end of the day in that particular field is his account of the native, and not an account of the native which he could claim as though it is universal. Why? Because the field became vibrant and alive because of the presence of the ethnographer. And his presence made possible the presence of other native people who are part of that particular field. And the field become historically possible because of the ethnographer and his respondents' presence together. And it is this particular presence and a particular interaction that had produced the field in a particular way, which will not be replicated if someone else would come to the field and do a similar kind of an ethnography among the same set of people. In other words, two ethnographies on the same field might differ in their intent and content. And therefore, to assign a sense of objectivity and neutrality and value freedom and scientificity to the ethnographic work would be a falsehood, because ethnographer has followed all the methods to make his account count as science. And he had said that I have followed this, I have followed that, I have used this, I have used that to count my research as science, but I have not established science. You get my point? That I have only used different repertoire of anthropology and fieldwork to count my work as science, but I have not established science. In other words, I have only been able to say what counts as science, but I have not been able to determine once and for all what science is. And it is that which has made ethnography somewhat inward looking, and therefore ethnography started to venture into different other disciplines, which is called the blurred genres. There's a very interesting piece written by Clifford Geertz. It's called the blurred genres, which is that ethnographer is going into the field and he's studying people only through his own interaction is just not enough to understand the field. A field needs to be understood as historically, in as much as by people who are present in the field, but more importantly, the people who are present in the field and the things that these people say are not entirely their creations. The things that people say are often the words and the wisdom of those who are not there anymore, but lying hidden behind those who are actually articulating their voices. It is exactly a novel. It is exactly a fiction. It is exactly a cinema, or it is exactly a book turned into a cinema, when you have many people saying many things, but what they say are not certainly their words in their entirety. Their words are also reflection of many other voices which are not there anymore, which are not present, which we cannot see, but nonetheless remain as very important voices. And therefore, there has been a shift in ethnography from 1980s onwards. Three important books I must let you know: Anthropology as a Cultural Critic by Marcus and Fisher, Predicament of Culture by James Clifford, and Writing Culture by Marcus and Clifford, which had set the tone for ethnography to become not only a study of the field from a multi points of view. In other words, hist- that field has to be known historically in as much as to be known through anthropology's presence. The characters that anthropology portray in the field is his portrayal, and at the same time, what they say, these characters, what they say, are not the characters entirely their coined words, but they are also representation of many other voices which are not there any longer. And this is what anthropology increasingly called a kind of a heterogeneous field, a field which is made possible by actors who are at the various intersections of discourses, right? In other words, if I am trying to talk about um, um, I'm trying to understand market in a particular in a particular community, then I must understand market not only uh, by understanding what people say and what people do in the market, but the ways in which people have understood market as a historical reality, that this was a market, what earlier it used to be, what was a kind of a market that they must have heard from their forefathers, what it used to be. All of these become very significant moments in creating and recreating the field. And ethnography, therefore, becomes just not a field work where you pick up a few methods such as participant observation, interview, note writing, transforming notes into narratives, into transcriptions. But ethnography is also about how you write an account of the people, how you make your presence a very intimate part of that account, because without your presence this account would never have been possible. To stay away from this, in a sense that I have provided an account as a dispassionate observer and therefore I have achieved objectivity and therefore I'm value free and therefore I'm free of biases, it is not enough to understand the field, because the field is already produced through your biases, produced through your presence, and produced through your engagement presence as a historical possibility. And therefore, that historical possibility be made part of writing ethnography while undertaking a field work. I hope I've been able to raise some of the points, but I'm not sure whether everything has gone home. But you are free to ask a few questions in case you have any. I think Shagnik Chakraborty was the one who did the talking at the very beginning, right?
Yes, sir. The session was
Are you
truly
all
enriching,
there,
sir.
or
And yes, sir, I'm there. I'm there since the very beginning. I'm listening to the lecture, sir.
Yes, sir.
so we are nearly close to finishing our session, this particular session. So if you have any questions, please raise, because I have talked for all these 2 hours and you were behind your camera. So, if you do not have any questions, should we end? Shagni,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I think it's better to end. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
sorry, I
Yes,
didn't
sir.
get you. I didn't get you.
Yes, sir. We should end, I think.
Yeah, okay.
No
Thank
questions
you
from
very
my side.
much.
Yeah. Thank you so. Thank you so much.